Welcome to the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. I'm Melisa Liberman, a fellow IC and business coach. On this podcast, I teach you to become a consistently booked independent consultant without becoming a pushy salesperson or working 24/7. If I can do it, you can too. Listen on to find out how. Welcome to episode 166 of the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. This is Melisa Liberman, and today we're talking about how setting a goal based on your corporate income or your past corporate income could backfire for you. And I want to bring this to your attention because so many consultants set their revenue goals based on what they had been making in corporate or what they would be making had they stayed in corporate. And as a result, it creates an unnecessary plateau in your business. It could even sabotage you and backfire on you. And that's what I want to bring to your attention today to help you avoid this mistake. So that's what this episode is about. We're going to talk about all the different angles here to help you avoid the mistake, whether you're consciously setting your revenue goal based on anchoring it to your corporate income, or whether you're doing this subconsciously, like a lot of consultants are, especially those of you who are further along in your business. I want to help you to see where you might be doing this and how it could be standing in your way and causing you to lose money or leave money on the table, and what to do instead. So that's what we're focused on here today, bringing this potential blind spot to your attention so that you can set your goals in a way that set you up for success. With that, let's talk through the agenda for today. First, I'll go over a companion resource for you. If you've been a listener to this podcast, you won't be surprised what it is, but I want to make sure that you have that companion resource so that you're able to put what we're talking about today into action. Then we'll talk about just what does this sound like? It might sound very specific of, I want to replace my corporate income, but there are other ways that this type of goal setting comes into play in your business in kind of sneakier ways. So I don't bring those to your attention. So you could really figure out where you might be making this mistake. And then we're going to talk about why it's a problem. Why is this a risk to anchor your revenue goals to your corporate income, or what you think your corporate income would have been had you stayed? Then I'm going to share with you 3 real life examples so that you can hear what it sounds like to make this mistake, what the impacts are, and then ultimately what to do about it. Then we'll dive into what to do instead. So instead of anchoring your revenue goals in some form or fashion, either directly or indirectly to what you would have been making had you stayed in corporate, what to do instead when you're setting revenue goals. And then finally, we'll wrap up. So that's what we have in store for today. Now let's talk about the companion resource. So again, if you've listened to the podcast for a while, you know the companion resource is most likely the book that I released earlier this year called Grow Your Consulting Business, the 14-step roadmap to make your independent consulting goals a reality. In chapter 4, I spend the entire chapter talking about how to set an effective business vision and goals for your business. So today we're just taking a little sliver of that. But if you go back to chapter 4 and really read through that and get a good sense of where you might be underselling yourself, where you might be underestimating yourself, where you might be creating unnecessary plateau in the goals that you're setting because you're somehow comparing them to your corporate experience. That's the essence of that chapter. So you can go download the book for free. Sometimes people ask me, why are you giving away the book for free? I'm giving away the book for free so that you can really download this, have a blueprint to grow your consulting business. And it also helps me know who you are. You share your name and your email address with me, and then we can start to have a dialogue. And I'll send you more resources and send you information about episodes that come out every week so that you don't miss them, and continue providing you with resources. And if at some point you feel that working with me as a coach might be something you want to consider, then I'll give the link to reach out to schedule that type of a call. That's why I provide my book for free. It's not about selling a bunch of books on Amazon, although that's great. And and quite frankly, I love having the paperback version. in addition to the PDF. But the point here, and the reason why I'm sharing this with you, is because I get it as a question a lot. And also for you to be thinking about what could be something that's really valuable for your end clients that would help you to know who they are and to start having a dialogue with them more directly. You don't need to write a book to accomplish this, but it is something that you might want to think about emulating as you're building out your process to attract and add value and ultimately create inbound leads for yourself. Okay, so that's a little backstory on the book. You can go download it at consultingbusinessbook.com, or the shortcut is melisabook.com. So go download it and look at chapter 4 in conjunction with today's episode to help you set more effective goals in your consulting business. And if you're listening in the real time, we are not that far away from midpoint in this year. How are you doing against your goals? Did you set goals? What's the percent achievement that you've got so far? Really take a step back and ask yourself that question. This is a great time in the year to revisit your goals, whether you're listening in the real time and it's May, or whether you really, as a part of your quarterly process, this is something that's really important. So, with that, let's dive into the next part of our agenda for today, which is, do any of these phrases sound familiar? I oftentimes work with independent consultants who are my coaching clients, and I ask them, what is your revenue goal? Sometimes I ask them, even though we've been working together for a while, I ask them because it's so fascinating to see how quickly we forget. In the example here, I'm working with a brand new client and I ask them, what is your revenue goal? And they tell me, and I ask them why. Why is that your revenue goal? And they oftentimes respond with something like, well, I want to replace my corporate income, especially if they're newer to consulting or running a consulting business. Or they might say, I want to make what I would have been making had I stayed in corporate. Those are two really common responses. And so for you, when you think about this, how are you setting your revenue goal? How did you set your revenue goal if you have one? Is it in some form or fashion anchored to what you would have been making in corporate or had been making in corporate? And ask yourself why. Why are you anchoring it to this corporate income? It's really interesting to explore this and really understand kind of the driver behind this. And that's what we're going to focus on some more. So the first thing that you want to be doing here is just really asking yourself, how are you setting your revenue goals, and in what ways could those goals possibly be tied to what you had been making in corporate? Let me give you another example. Sometimes, especially if you're a little bit further along in your business, sometimes you might think about your revenue goals in a way of, well, I'm just going to make 10% more than I made last year. That's another way that you're tying what you've been doing to your corporate income in a sense. It's a reflection of what you might have been used to in corporate, where you're getting cost of living increases and some kind of year over year incremental bump. It's the same concept. So you want to be really thinking about, how are you setting these goals? What is the driver behind the way you're setting your goals? And ultimately, how might that be limiting what you're capable of achieving? That leads us so nicely into why anchoring to your past corporate income, or some estimate of what you would have been making had you stayed in corporate. Why is this a risk? Why is this a risk? Of course, you need a starting point, especially if you're brand new. It doesn't hurt to have some form of a starting point, but be cognizant that when you create this type of starting point that's based off of your corporate income or your past corporate income, it can be a long time limiter if you don't, separate those things fairly quickly. So if you want to use it as your first year, it can be a good place to start. I'm going to show you here in a minute with an example why you don't have to do it that way, but definitely don't anchor to it. And this is why. The reason why is it becomes an unnecessary limit, a false ceiling for yourself. When you think about setting, it's an arbitrary number. All of the numbers are truly arbitrary. What you were paid in corporate was arbitrary. It's all arbitrary. So when you think about the number you had been making in corporate and what you want to be making now as a business owner, there's absolutely no tie to those two things, other than You thinking of yourself in a way of this is what level of an income earner I am. This is how much I make, as a professional. And so go back to the table and think about how much money do you want to make for your lifestyle, for your goals, for the way you want to be living and donating and creating, legacy and that sort of thing. So when you are anchoring your revenue goals to your corporate income, what it ultimately means is that you are most likely leaving money on the table. You're most likely creating a dynamic where you're creating very incremental growth in your business, maybe 5% year over year or 10% year over year, whatever you might have been used to when you worked in corporate is what you're just unknowingly or subconsciously recreating. And ultimately, this is also keeping you stuck in thinking as an employee in some sense versus as a business owner. When you fully make that shift over from to being a business owner and thinking about your revenue without any attachment to how that compares to what you had been or could be making in corporate, then you unleash yourself with the ability to think about what might your business look like. How much money do you want to be making? What do you want your capacity to look like and your utilization? And set your goals in that way versus comparing them back to what you had been making in corporate. So, those are some of the risks that you are facing when you're thinking about your revenue goal in the context of what you had been making in your corporate role or what someone who's in corporate doing something similar to what you're doing would be making. All of those attachments end up creating this limitation for you. And we don't want that. Now, let's talk about in more detail what that means. So, I referenced for you a minute ago the way you're thinking about yourself. And if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, mindset comes into play in every type of conversation that we have. A strategy about how to set your revenue goals or how to execute a sales process effectively. All of it comes back to mindset in some form or fashion. And this is no different. So when you think about the revenue goal that you've created for yourself and the way that it might be tied back to the corporate context, one of the examples that I want to really highlight here is this idea that you start thinking of yourself as someone who earns that amount of money. In corporate, let's say that you earn 250K as an example. Doesn't matter if it include bonuses or not in bonuses. We're just talking about, generally speaking, you're someone who typically earned 250K. It can be really easy to start attaching that to your identity in a certain sense and to really think about yourself and label yourself as I'm a professional who makes around 250K per year. When you are thinking of yourself that way, and so often it comes from that corporate context. I notice myself doing this, and I haven't been in corporate for 12 years. When you're doing this and thinking about yourself in the context of how much money that you had been making when you were in corporate, it creates a bias in how you operate and how you think and how you approach problems or what problems you're not even thinking about because you're thinking about the way you're running your business as I'm a professional who makes about 250K. And that becomes a self fulfilling prophecy. The reason why it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy is because when you're thinking, I'm a professional who makes around 250K per year, for example, it influences what you offer. It might mean that you start focusing more on execution over strategy or more on implementation over advisory. It influences your pricing, what you're even willing to propose. Think about this. If you think of yourself as, whatever the number was that you made in corporate, the example I'm using here is 250. When you think of yourself as someone who earns 250, the first thing you're going to do from a pricing perspective is divide that up and figure out what that means by hour. And that's most likely what you're going to use as a basis of your pricing. So of course it creates an unnecessary limit and a bias in how you're operating. It's not influencing the way you think about the value that you're delivering. You're just basically trying to recreate in some way, and oftentimes subconsciously recreate what you had already been doing in corporate because it's familiar to you. The other thing that it does is when you are thinking of yourself in the context of how much money you made in corporate, it influences your positioning. It influences your positioning. Now, think about this, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, but it happens. When we are in corporate, we think of ourselves and compare ourselves to others and almost create a kind of a pecking order based on what our title was or based on how much we know we're earning and guess what other people are earning. We create these rankings in our mind, these pecking orders in our minds, these org charts in our minds, and it influences the way that we carry ourselves, the way we portray ourselves, how willing we are to approach certain individuals with certain titles or not. So when you think about this and you carry that over from corporate into the way you're running your business, of course, you're going to create a bias in how you operate. And that bias is going to be attached to the number you're capable of earning. I'm a professional who makes 250K per year, for example, or I'm here to replace my corporate income. Then you end up just recreating exactly what you had in a slightly different business model, essentially. Now you're a business owner with a lot more risk and responsibility than you were when you were in corporate and didn't, creating a paycheck and had different types of risks and responsibilities. So this is why it's so important when you're thinking of yourself in this way and attaching yourself to how much you had been making in corporate or could be making in corporate. Hopefully now you can see how this could put unnecessary limitations on yourself because it suppresses the way that you're thinking. It dilutes what you think is possible and creates this dynamic where you just keep recreating the same thing over and over again. And that's what we want to help you avoid in today's episode and in general. So now let's drill down into another level of detail and talk more about, and I'll share with you several examples to help bring this to life. So the first example that I want to share with you today is let's go back to that 250K goal. The example here is I asked a consultant, we were just getting started working together, and I asked her what her goal was, and she told me it was 250K. I hear this a lot. She said, and I asked her why. And she said, I just, I'm fairly new at this. I've only had a few projects under my belt. I think her business was maybe 6 months old or something like that. And so she said, I just want to get started by replacing my corporate income. And so I wanted to help her to see that that isn't necessarily an apples to apples comparison. That I knew, you know how they say when you're in a courtroom, let's say you're a lawyer, you're in a courtroom and they say, never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. I already knew what was going to happen in some sense, just because I knew what her skill set was. I knew what she was capable of doing. And so I walked her through a process that I walk all of my clients through, which is to get a better sense, a very clear picture of their business model. And so we walked through this exercise and aligned the type of work that she wanted to do, what were the offers that she wanted to ideally, deliver to her clients. We made some best guesses about what the pricing would look like, not because we were dividing the number of her former corporate salary or that 250 by a number of hours to get an hourly rate. We looked at it from the value perspective at a high level for those ideal clients. And then we looked at her capacity. And so by triangulating all of that, the answer was $450,000. She initially said to me, I want to make 250. That's my goal for this year. As we went through this exercise, by detaching ourselves from that corporate context, what she had previously made in corporate, her goal came out to be 450K. And what she said to me is, this is surprisingly doable. She shocked herself. This based on all of this buildup essentially of the revenue goal, this is surprisingly doable. Before she had attached 250K felt kind of hard, felt kind of the way that she was grinding in corporate. And now when we took that association off the table, we built up her business model without an attachment to the corporate context. And then she realized that 450K was much more doable than what she would have thought otherwise when she was thinking about it from that corporate lens. So hopefully this gives you a really good sense of why it's so important to detach your revenue goals from what you had been making in corporate. Let's take another example. Example number two, there are three examples. Example number two, a 325K goal. So I was working with a consultant. He told me that his goal was 325. And I asked why. And he said, well, it's about 10% more than I made last year. And so I asked, why does that matter? And he just explained, honestly, that's what I'm used to. I'm used to having kind of a cost of living increase year over year and merit of 10% in my corporate role. And so I walked him through again that exercise of building up his revenue goals based on what type of work he wanted to be doing, what type of pricing he would be offering, what the capacity goals would look like. And that exercise came out at 500K instead of 325. Now, what he said to me was that feels like a stretch. It didn't feel so kind of slam dunk like the last example. It felt like more of a stretch. And of course, it would feel like more of a stretch because you're used to, in this case, especially, this person was used to having a 10% year over year increment. And so now you've got to learn the mental side and the strategy and the tactics around how do you become a business owner who generates year over year increasing revenues that are greater than 10%, for example. And so that's in some ways confronting about who, in this case, who this consultant thought he was and what he's capable of. But the start of it is really getting clear on how could, in this case, he moved from 325 to 500. How could that be doable? And we did that through that business modeling and also through, the mindset work to start shifting away from corporate has nothing to do with your revenue goal. Corporate has nothing to do with what's possible for you. And so detaching those two things for this scenario made that possible for him. Okay, let's move on to the third example here to bring this to life. And the third example I want to share with you is a 500K goal. So this consultant told me she had a 500K goal for the year. Of course, you won't be surprised. I asked why. And she explained to me that it's what she would have been making if she stayed in corporate. Now, on the surface, that might seem really logical. Well, if I had stayed in corporate, this is roughly what I would have been making. So I just want to kind of keep on track with that. But what I want to offer to you is that that is truly apples to oranges. And truly, when you're anchoring into that way, it's almost as if you're punishing yourself for having left corporate and giving yourself a justification that it was okay that you left corporate because you're still making roughly the same amount. That's not what you're doing here. What you're doing here and what this consultant was doing, she built a business because she wanted to. She wanted to be able to pick and choose who she was working with. She wanted to have unlimited income potential. And so, again, when you start attaching, like she did, this idea of, well, I just want to break even almost. This is what this example is in a way, right? I just want to break even. Oh, if I had stayed in corporate, this is what I would have been making. And now I want to just break even and not feel like I have lost money by moving over versus thinking about this in the opposite way, which is what is possible for me in my business and how much money could I be making that has nothing to do with what I was making or could be making in corporate. So again, in this example, I walked her through that business modeling exercise where we worked on what is it that she wanted to be offering and looked at her past offerings and how she wanted to adjust those, what her pricing ideally looks like, and her capacity. We triangulated all of that and built up a business case that put her into $1 million goal. $1 million goal. So it doubled what she had anticipated that she could make or by anchoring just to what she would have been making had she stayed in corporate. Again, for her, jumping from 500 to a million felt like a huge, a big leap. But she could see on paper, this is possible. She said to me, I have a lot of adjustments to make, both in what I'm offering, how I'm positioning it, how I'm pricing it, dialing in my sales process. But I do see on paper how it's possible. And the benefit of going for that $1 million goal, even if I don't hit it, there's so many tangible and intangible outcomes that could come from that. Making more money, most likely, even if you don't hit the 500K goal. Let's say you make
750K. That's 250K more than you would have if you had just hit a slam dunk goal of 500, right? And that's what she was saying to me. And she was also saying to me, look, also know that I'm going to have to up level everything I'm doing, which not only is, from the value of personal and professional growth that she valued, but also helped to strengthen her foundation for future years to come. So hopefully those three examples give you a really good sense of what we're talking about here and how by anchoring your revenue goals into your corporate income by comparing it in some form or fashion is going to cause you to under earn and underdevelop as a business owner. So let's wrap up this episode by focusing on what to do instead. What to do instead. So I just told you, for the last 20 or so minutes, what not to do. Don't anchor your revenue goals to what you had been making in corporate, what you could be making in corporate, or what your year over year increases were in corporate. So now we want to switch over to what to do instead. And so take the examples that I gave you and do the same type of exercise that I did with those clients that I just described to you. Those other independent consultants. You want to be setting your goals based on your ideal view of what you want to do, what kind of services you want to offer and provide and deliver, what your pricing looks like, what the average contract value is, for example, and what you want your capacity to look like. Triangulate all of those, build up yourself a business model, and then use that data, that build up to choose your revenue goal. Most likely it is going to be more than what you made in corporate or I've been telling you not to compare it, but for a moment, if we compare it, it should be more than what you expected it to be. I'll just say it that way. It should be more than what you expected it to be. Not because you're greedy, not because you're just pursuing money for the sake of money, but because you're truly capable of making more money than you probably are giving yourself credit for. Now, once you get that revenue goal, the other thing I want to encourage you to do is to not worry about it being realistic. We've talked about this on this podcast before. Don't worry about the number being realistic. In fact, if you feel like the number is realistic, then I encourage you to add 25% to it or double it even. Because the growth in your business and for you as a business owner comes from you stretching yourself and getting comfortable with not always hitting a goal, but knowing that the type of services that you deliver will be improved because you're going after something that's greater than what you've accomplished before. You'll likely make more money because you're going after something that you haven't accomplished before. That you start allowing yourself to evolve into advisory type work or strategy type work that replaces some of the implementation and execution that you can do in your sleep and it no longer lights you up. Those are all such good reasons to do this. And remember that 80% of a big goal is always going to be greater than 100% of a small goal. So, for example, if you set a goal, your initial goal was 200. So 100% of 200 is 200, obviously. What if you bump it up to 500K? 80% of 500K is 400K. That's double what you would have made. Who cares if you only hit 80% of your goal? Getting comfortable with only hitting 80% of your goal so that you can continue evolving and advancing your business versus just always needing to hold on to and protect that you hit your goal every single time by 100%. That's a whole nother episode, honestly. And I know we've talked about it on this podcast in so many different ways, but it's really important. And so that's why I wanted to reemphasize that here. And then finally, please, I implore you to stop comparing anything you're doing in your business to how you did it in corporate. It's not a good index or baseline for you. Now, of course, there are things like frameworks and methodologies and lessons learned that you want to pull forward. But when you're just subconsciously running your business and making decisions about your business model and your revenue goals based on what you were used to in corporate, because it's just one piece of context, that's where you end up leaving money on the table. And I don't want you to do that. So I encourage you and listen, you're going to do it. I just shared with you, I did it, recently, even though I know better. I've been an independent consultant now for almost as long as I worked in corporate. It's going to happen, but catch yourself and realize when you're doing this and therefore redirect yourself versus going down a path where you set your business strategy based on what you had done in corporate. All right, my friend, that's what I have for you today. I encourage you to go download the book. You can find it at melisabook.com and download the book, read chapter 4, revisit your goals and your vision. It's important to do that periodically and question, why did you set the revenue goal that you did? How could some of the overhang of corporate be influencing you? And how can you continue separating that so you don't have to be tied down to any of those corporate constructs anymore? All right. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again next week. Take care.
Thanks for joining me this week on the Grow Your Independent Consulting Business podcast. If you liked today's episode, I have 3 quick next steps for you. First, click subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Next, leave me a review in your podcast app so other independent consultants can find and benefit too. And finally, to put the ideas from today's episode into action, head over to melisaliberman.com for the show notes and more resources to help you grow your consulting practice from your first few projects into a full-fledged business. See you next week.